South Georgia lies in the South Atlantic Ocean, east of the southern tip of South America. It is long and narrow, rising abruptly from cold water into a chain of peaks covered in snow and ice. Glaciers descend from the interior toward the sea, breaking into crevassed fields before terminating in rocky bays. The island's coastline is irregular. Fjords cut inward between steep ridges. Wind moves consistently across the slopes, driven by weather systems that circle Antarctica. Temperatures remain low throughout the year, though seasonal variation exists. Snowfall is frequent at higher elevations, while rain and sleet dominate lower ground. There are few natural landing points. Swell and surf limit access along most of the coast. In the early 20th century, the only permanent human presence consisted of whaling stations established along the northern shore. These settlements were industrial outposts, not towns, positioned where ships could anchor and process catches. The island's interior remained largely unmapped in 1916. Peaks rose beyond 7,000 feet. Glaciers intersected one another, forming a complex network of ice and rock. There were no marked routes across the mountains, no established crossings. Movement inland required assessment rather than reliance on known paths. Isolation defines South Georgia more than latitude alone. It lies far from regular shipping routes. Communication with the outside world depended on visiting vessels. Weather could prevent departure or arrival for extended periods. From the coast, the interior appears continuous and impassable. Snowfields blend into ridges. Valleys disappear into shadow. There are no visual indicators of passage. The island offers resources near shore, freshwater streams, wildlife, but little accommodation inland. In 1916, this landscape was not intended as a destination for crossing. It was a remote industrial point in a cold ocean. The mountains were a backdrop to maritime work, not a route between coasts. The island did not signal danger. It simply existed, ice, rock, and wind shaped over centuries, indifferent to those who might attempt to move across it. The challenge was not announced in advance. It became apparent only when necessity required crossing ground that had never been traversed. The crossing of South Georgia in 1916 was not part of the original plan. It emerged from the failure of a larger objective, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, led by Ernest Shackleton. The expedition aimed to complete the first land crossing of Antarctica, from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, by way of the South Pole. The ship assigned to carry Shackleton's party into the Weddell Sea was the Endurance. Built for strength in ice, the vessel departed in 1914 with a crew of 27 men, along with dogs, sledges, and equipment intended for prolonged travel across the Antarctic continent. In January 1915, the Endurance became trapped in pack ice before reaching the intended landing site. The ice closed around the hull gradually, immobilizing the ship. For months, the vessel drifted northward with the frozen sea. The crew maintained routine and discipline while waiting for a break in conditions that did not come. By October 1915, pressure from the surrounding ice began to crush the hull. Timbers bent and cracked. Water entered the interior compartments. Despite efforts to brace and pump, the ship could not withstand the compression. On November 21, 1915, the Endurance sank beneath the ice. The men established camp on the ice floe, salvaging supplies, boats, and instruments. For months, they drifted with the pack until it began to break apart in April 1916. At that point, they launched 3 lifeboats and navigated through open water toward the nearest known land. After days of exposure in the Southern Ocean, they reached Elephant Island, remote, uninhabited, and beyond regular shipping routes. It offered temporary refuge, but no prospect of rescue without outside intervention. Shackleton concluded that help would have to be sought elsewhere. He selected 5 men and modified the strongest lifeboat, the James Caird, for a voyage across approximately 800 miles of open ocean to South Georgia. The crossing took 16 days under severe conditions, guided by limited celestial navigation. On May 10, 1916, the James Caird reached the southern coast of South Georgia at King Haakon Bay. The landing was difficult but successful. However, they had arrived on the uninhabited side of the island. The whaling stations, and any chance of immediate assistance, lay across the mountainous interior. The expedition's original objective had long since dissolved. Survival now depended on moving from a remote southern bay to the northern coast, across terrain no one had previously crossed. The journey ahead was not exploratory. It was a necessity imposed by geography. The landing at King Haakon Bay provided immediate relief from the open ocean, but did not resolve isolation. The southern coast of South Georgia was uninhabited and exposed to heavy swell. Steep cliffs and glaciers descended directly into the sea. There were no established routes inland and no visible signs of settlement. The men who came ashore from the James Caird were exhausted. The 16-day voyage had depleted their strength. Clothing was soaked and worn thin. Frostbite and salt sores marked their skin. Rest was necessary, but time was limited. Winter conditions were advancing, and remaining in place offered no guarantee of rescue. The whaling stations at Stromness, Husvik, and Leith lay on the northern coast of the island. To reach them by boat would require navigating around the island's western tip through uncertain waters with a damaged vessel and an exhausted crew. Shackleton assessed that option as too dangerous. The alternative was to cross the island's interior on foot. No maps existed for the route. The mountainous spine of South Georgia was largely unexplored. Peaks rose steeply from sea level to over 7,000 feet. Glaciers intersected one another without clear passage. Crevasses and cornices were hidden beneath fresh snow. Shackleton selected 2 companions for the crossing: Frank Worsley, the expedition's navigator, and Tom Crean, an experienced seaman accustomed to polar travel. The remaining 3 men stayed behind at the bay, tasked with preserving the boat and shelter until help could return. Equipment was limited. There were no tents, sleeping bags, or mountaineering tools designed for glacier travel. Each man carried a small pack containing food for a few days, a stove, rope, and basic instruments. They traveled without skis or snowshoes. The decision to leave was not delayed by uncertainty. Remaining where they were offered no better outcome. On May 19, 1916, the 3 men set out before dawn. The objective was direct: reach the northern coast as quickly as possible. There was no margin for prolonged travel. Exposure would compound with each hour. Movement would need to be continuous. The shoreline disappeared behind them as they climbed into the interior. Snowfields rose ahead, intersected by ridges and shadows. There were no established tracks. Every step required assessment. Every ridge concealed another beyond it. The point of no return was immediate. Once committed to the ascent, retreat would mean recrossing terrain already negotiated, with diminishing strength. The crossing was not exploratory. It was an attempt to convert isolation into contact within the narrowest possible time frame. Survival now depended on a direct passage across frozen peaks that had never been mapped or traversed. The island offered no guidance. It required movement without precedent. On the morning of May 19, 1916, Ernest Shackleton, Frank Worsley, and Tom Crean began climbing from King Haakon Bay into the interior of South Georgia. They carried approximately 3 days' rations, a length of rope, an adze, a Primus stove, and a small quantity of fuel. They wore clothing hardened by salt and ice, with hobnail boots unsuitable for steep glacier travel. There were no crampons. The initial ascent led over a snow slope that angled sharply upward from the bay. Snow depth varied, sometimes firm enough to bear weight, sometimes collapsing to knee height. The men moved rope together across exposed sections. The rope was short, limiting distance between them and reducing slack that might accelerate a fall. Navigation depended on observation rather than maps. Worsley used a prismatic compass where visibility allowed, but cloud and terrain frequently obstructed long sightlines. The objective was to maintain a general northerly direction, descending eventually toward the whaling stations, known to lie on the island's opposite side. By midday, they had reached a high ridge and observed a complex landscape of glaciers and peaks extending ahead. Valleys opened unexpectedly, revealing steep descents rather than gradual slopes. Several times they had to alter course to avoid impassable ice falls and crevasse fields. Crevasses were the most immediate hazard. Some were visible as dark lines in the snow, others were concealed by thin crusts. Probing with the adze and testing weight carefully became routine. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles. A misstep would have resulted in injury or delay they could not absorb. As daylight waned, temperatures dropped. The men had no sleeping bags. Stopping for extended rest risked freezing. They elected to continue through the night. Movement generated heat. Stillness would have lost it. They ate small portions while walking, conserving both time and warmth. During one descent, the slope ahead was too steep to downclimb safely. Shackleton proposed sliding. They sat and used the adze as a brake, controlling speed as best they could. The descent carried them hundreds of feet down a snowfield. The maneuver was not without risk, but it avoided hours of careful stepping that would have drained strength. Fatigue accumulated steadily. The crossing was continuous, with only brief pauses to melt snow for water. The Primus stove was lit sparingly to conserve fuel. Snow was melted in a tin and passed between them. Sleep came in short intervals of minutes, taken while standing or crouched against wind. At one point, they encountered a large glacier descending into a valley whose orientation was uncertain. The sound of distant surf reached them faintly, indicating proximity to the coast, but direction was unclear. The island's interior reflected sound unpredictably. Determining which valley led to Stromness required judgment without confirmation. Cloud lifted briefly during the second morning, revealing peaks behind and ahead. Shackleton assessed that they had crossed the central spine and were now descending northward. The terrain, however, remained severe. Ice gave way to broken rock and hard-packed snow. The final descent involved negotiating a waterfall valley partially free of snow. Ice crust gave way underfoot. Boots slipped on wet stone. The men moved cautiously, aware that injury at this stage would reverse all progress. Exhaustion impaired balance and focus, but discipline held. After approximately 36 hours of continuous movement, they heard the whistle of the Stromness whaling station's morning call. The sound was unmistakable, industrial, human, structured. It confirmed orientation more reliably than any compass. They descended toward the coast, emerging near the outskirts of the station. Their appearance, bearded, thin, dressed in patched clothing, did not initially signal identity. They asked for the station manager by name. Recognition followed only after conversation. The crossing had been completed without rest beyond brief pauses. It had not followed a mapped route. It succeeded because movement continued without interruption, and because decisions favored speed over comfort and risk over delay when necessary. The island did not yield passage. It permitted it only where effort aligned with narrow margins. The 36-hour crossing transformed isolation into contact, but it did not conclude the broader task. The men left behind at King Haakon Bay still awaited retrieval. The 36-hour crossing was continuous, but it was not steady. Progress varied between measured ascent and abrupt improvisation. Fatigue did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated with each decision that avoided delay but increased strain. By the second night, sleep deprivation altered perception. The men had paused only briefly to melt snow and consume small amounts of food. Shackleton later recorded that they allowed themselves 5-minute intervals of rest at a time. Longer pauses risked entering sleep too deeply to rise again in the cold. Worsley and Crean complied without debate. The margin between recovery and freezing was narrow. Route finding grew more complex as they descended. Valleys that appeared to lead north sometimes curved east or west unexpectedly. Snow bridges concealed crevasses near the lower glaciers. Probing slowed progress, but was unavoidable. The rope between them remained taut across uncertain sections. A fall by one would have endangered all three. At one point, they faced a steep snow slope, terminating in broken ice. Climbing down would have required cutting steps with the adze for hours. Instead, they chose another controlled slide, steering toward what appeared to be a safer runout. The descent succeeded, but it depended on snow consistency and alignment. A change in surface condition could have altered the outcome. Navigation, by sound, introduced additional uncertainty. The whistle from Stromness was heard faintly and then lost again as wind shifted. They altered direction slightly to follow the echo. Without a map, they inferred the location of the whaling station from coastline orientation and glacier flow. These assessments relied on accumulated observation rather than reference. Boots, soaked from earlier travel, hardened overnight. Hobnails offered limited traction on ice. Foot placement required constant attention. A twisted ankle or fall would have immobilized one of them. The absence of spare clothing or medical supplies amplified risk. Despite exhaustion, there was no recorded argument among the three. Decisions were brief and executed immediately. Each man understood that hesitation could expand exposure. The objective was singular: reach the northern coast before strength declined further. The final descent into the valley leading to Stromness was through steep, partially thawed terrain. Waterfalls cut through snowpack, exposing rock. The men lowered themselves carefully, using rope where possible. At lower elevation, patches of grass and rock appeared for the first time since departure. The sound of industrial activity confirmed proximity to settlement. When they reached the outskirts of the whaling station, their appearance delayed recognition. Only after conversation did station manager Thorolf Cyril understand who they were. The crossing succeeded, not because terrain eased, but because the men maintained forward movement within strict limits. Every decision carried risk. None allowed retreat. Exhaustion was managed through pace rather than relief. The island had offered no marked path. It had demanded constant adjustment. The narrow margins between failure and success were measured in minutes of rest, degrees of slope, and inches of snow cover. The 36 hours did not include safety. They included continuity. The task that remained was not survival of three, but rescue of the 22 men still waiting on the southern shore. When Ernest Shackleton, Frank Worsley, and Tom Crean arrived at the outskirts of the Stromness whaling station on May 20th, 1916, their appearance did not immediately communicate their identity. Their clothing was torn and layered with salt and soot. Beards obscured their faces. Boots were worn thin. They had been moving without sustained rest for 36 hours after a 16-day ocean crossing. The station manager, Thorolf Cyril, recognized Shackleton only after hearing him speak and studying his features closely. The men were brought inside. Hot baths were prepared. Clean clothing was issued. Food was provided gradually to avoid shock after prolonged exertion and rationing. Initial rest was brief. Shackleton's focus shifted immediately to the men left behind at King Haakon Bay and those still waiting on Elephant Island. Communication was sent to other stations on the island to organize assistance. Within hours, a small vessel departed to retrieve the three men at the southern bay. The boat rounded the coast under improving weather conditions. The rescue of those at King Haakon Bay was completed without loss. The 6 who had made the ocean voyage were reunited at Stromness. The larger task remained, reaching Elephant Island, nearly 800 miles away. Multiple attempts were required due to sea ice blocking approach routes. Only on August 30th, 1916, over 3 months after the crossing of South Georgia, did Shackleton reach Elephant Island with the Chilean vessel Yelcho. All 22 men who had remained there were found alive. The crossing of South Georgia had not been an isolated achievement. It was a necessary link in a longer chain of survival. The whaling station provided immediate aid and the logistical base required to attempt further rescues. Without the 36-hour passage across the island, that assistance would not have materialized. The mountains remained unchanged after the crossing. Snow continued to accumulate on ridges. Glaciers shifted imperceptibly. No markers were left behind. The route was not documented in detail until later. At the time, it was simply the path that had allowed 3 men to convert isolation into contact. The resolution was practical rather than ceremonial. Warmth replaced exposure. Food replaced rationing. Communication replaced silence. Survival shifted from endurance under constraint to coordinated retrieval. The 36-hour crossing of South Georgia was not an act of exploration in the conventional sense. It was not undertaken to chart territory or extend geographic knowledge. It occurred because remaining in place would have led to failure. The mountains were not an objective. They were an obstacle between isolation and assistance. What distinguished the crossing was not speed alone, but continuity. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean moved without extended rest, because stopping would have reduced their margin of survival. Decisions were constrained by cold, terrain, and limited equipment. Each choice favored progress over comfort and motion over safety in the short term. Leadership during the expedition's collapse had already shifted from ambition to preservation. The destruction of the Endurance, the drift on pack ice, the open boat voyage to South Georgia, each phase required adaptation to conditions beyond control. The crossing of the island was the final transition from endurance to intervention. The mountains of South Georgia remain largely unchanged since 1916. Routes have since been mapped. Crossings have been repeated with modern equipment. The original passage, however, was made without those references. It succeeded because 3 men maintained discipline under exhaustion and navigated by observation rather than certainty. The event occupies a place in exploration history not because it conquered terrain, but because it connected survival to rescue. The island did not yield easily. It allowed passage only within narrow margins. When the crossing ended at Stromness, it did not conclude the expedition's hardship. It simply altered its direction, from waiting to acting, from isolation to coordination. The frozen peaks had been crossed not for discovery, but so that others might leave them alive.